Chapter 8. War and Peace. The day after John and Yoko got married in 1969, they went to Amsterdam. It was an interesting week for a new husband and wife. For 7 days, they sat on their hotel bed and talked to reporters about peace. They called their war protest a bed-in, and it was on TV around the world. At the time, there were wars in many countries, like Northern Ireland, Nigeria, and Mozambique. One of the worst wars was in Vietnam. 500,000 Americans went and fought there, and every day hundreds of people died. Many people wanted to stop the war. The second bed-in protest was in Montreal, Canada, in May 1969. One day, John recorded a song called "Give Peace a Chance." There were many people in their room that day, reporters, musicians, and friends. John played the guitar and sang, and everyone became the band. They hit the tables with their hands and sang with him. It became the most famous song of the Vietnam War protest. On the 15th of November that year, hundreds of thousands of people sang "Give Peace a Chance" outside the White House in Washington, D.C. Later that year, John recorded a song called "Happy Christmas, War is Over." And John and Yoko paid for posters in 10 cities around the world. The posters said, "War is over, if you want it," in many different languages. This was John and Yoko's message to the world. After John and Yoko moved to the USA, John talked about peace on TV, and he went to many protests about wars and spoke to the crowds. Millions of young Americans listened to him, and the government was not happy. The FBI, government police, began to watch John, and they listened to his telephone. In 1972, the government wrote him a letter. "You must leave the country," the letter said. Yoko and John wanted to stay in the USA. So they talked to a lawyer called Leon Wildes. Wildes was not very interested in John's war protests or his music, but he worked very hard for John and Yoko. It took 4 years, but in the end, John Lennon could live freely in the USA. John liked the work of Gandhi and Martin Luther King. These men changed the world. But they did not do it with guns. They changed it with love, protests, and peace. Before John Lennon, rock stars and film stars did not usually talk about peace or changing the world. Today, people like Bono, Angelina Jolie, and George Clooney work hard for peace, and they help thousands of people around the world. Chapter 9. A Quiet Life. The 9th of October 1975 was a very important day for John and Yoko. Their son, Sean Taro Lennon, was born on John's 35th birthday. When John's first son, Julian, was born, he did not see him very much because he was in the Beatles. This time, he wanted to be a better father, so he stopped making music. John became a house husband. Yoko worked, and John stayed at home all day with Sean. They often went out for lunch or dinner or shopping, and they played with their cats. John did everything for Sean, and he sang to him at night. Julian sometimes visited them in the USA too. Mimi never came to New York, but John often asked her. She was afraid of the USA because many Americans had guns. John and Yoko now lived in a famous New York building called the Dakota. From their windows, you could see the trees and gardens of Central Park. John and Yoko took Sean to Central Park all the time. New Yorkers often saw them when they walked there. "Hey, John, how are you?" people called. But fans did not run after him. John loved that. John did not make any albums for 5 years, but he bought records and listened to the latest music, from glam rock to punk. He worked on his 3rd book too, and wrote lots of letters to friends, family, and fans. He did some art, and he made nice dinners at home. And he learned some Japanese, because John, Yoko, and Sean went to Japan in 1977. They stayed there all summer, and John and Sean met Yoko's family for the first time. The Lennons usually lived in their home in the Dakota, but they had a beautiful house near the sea on Long Island too. John learned to sail there, and he loved it. In June 1980, John sailed from Rhode Island to Bermuda with some friends. At first, everything went well. But then, some very bad Atlantic weather hit them. Some of John's friends became ill, so for hours John did all the sailing. He was afraid, but he stood out there in the rain and sang songs. Sean and Yoko met John and his friends when they arrived in Hamilton, Bermuda, and John stayed there with Sean for 2 months. He began to work on a new album, and he wrote some great songs, like Woman and Beautiful Boy. Then, one day, he saw a beautiful flower in the gardens in Hamilton. It was called Double Fantasy, and John loved the name. When he went back to New York, John wanted to record an album called Double Fantasy. John was excited about music again, and he began to record new songs. One day, that autumn, John and Yoko were in the recording studio all night. In the morning, they heard John's first new record, the song Just Like Starting Over, on the radio. They were very happy, and they danced around the room. Chapter 10. Dead Heroes. On the 9th of October 1980, Sean and John had their 5th and 40th birthdays. Fans waited outside the Dakota, and at 5 p.m. they looked up and saw planes in the sky. The planes wrote a message. Happy birthday, John and Sean. Love, Yoko. 8,000 kilometers away, in Hawaii, it was 11 o'clock in the morning, and a man called Mark David Chapman could hear something in his head. Kill someone famous. 2 weeks after John's birthday, Chapman bought a gun, got a plane to New York City, and visited the Dakota. But he could not buy bullets for his gun in New York City, so he left. On the 5th of December, John talked to a reporter from a music magazine about the film star James Dean. James Dean died very young, and he became a hero for young people. I don't want to be a dead hero, John said. The next day, Mark Chapman came back to New York City. This time, he had bullets. On Monday, the 8th of December, 1980, John and Yoko left the Dakota at around 5 p.m. Chapman came up to them. He had John's new double fantasy album, and John wrote on it for him. John and Yoko worked in the recording studio that evening, and John phoned Mimi. At about 10:45 p.m., John and Yoko came back home. Their driver often drove the car into the Dakota. But it was a nice evening, so this time he stopped outside in the street. John and Yoko got out of the car. Chapman was in the street near the door of the Dakota. He took out his gun and shot John Lennon 4 times. Then he sat and waited for the police. An ambulance arrived very quickly and took John to Roosevelt Hospital. But he was dead when he arrived there. Soon, TV across the USA and the world told people, John Lennon is dead. Crowds of people came to the Dakota. He's not dead. It's not true, one girl cried. But it was. The next Sunday in Liverpool, thousands of people stood in the streets. They remembered their city's dead hero, and they listened to his songs. Across the Atlantic, in New York City's Central Park, a crowd of 150,000 people stood in the cold. Some quietly cried. Some sang John Lennon's songs. They had photos of John and big messages. Why? Read one message. We'll never forget you, read another. And they did not. New York City was John's second home. And now there is a place in Central Park called Strawberry Fields, like John's famous song. It is a quiet place, and people sit there and think. There is a memorial at Strawberry Fields, too. A circle with the word imagine in it. People leave flowers on the circle, and sometimes people leave their guitars. Every year, on the 8th of December, people meet in Central Park. They remember John's life, and they sing his songs. Thousands came in 2010, 30 years after he died. Chapter 11. Remembering John Lennon. There are many John Lennon statues and John Lennon memorials around the world. One of the best statues is near the old Cavern Club in Liverpool. It is John when he was a young Beatle. He is standing next to a building with his hands in his pockets. A young man with a big dream. The year after John died, George Harrison wrote a song about his old friend, and George, Paul and Ringo recorded it. Later, Paul McCartney remembered John in his song Here Today. There were songs by bands and singers like the Cranberries, Queen, and Elton John too. Paul, George and Ringo all became solo musicians after the Beatles broke up, and they all performed at concerts around the world. Paul McCartney became one of the greatest British singers of his time. George Harrison died in 2001, but Paul and Ringo never stopped performing. Julian and Sean Lennon became musicians like their father. They want to make the world a better place, and they do a lot of important work and help many different people. Yoko Ono finished John Lennon's last album after he died, and his last book too. She became an important artist, musician, and peace worker. She never left the Dakota. She stayed there because she wanted to remember all the good times there with him. After John died, many fans wanted to buy some of his things, like letters or albums with his writing on them. In 1982, someone bought his car for $2.23 million. But most people want to remember the man and his music. There are lots of books, magazines, and films about John Lennon, and 200,000 people buy his albums every year. When many people think about John Lennon, they remember his song, Imagine. It became one of the most important songs of all time. But it was John Lennon's message to the world, too. Imagine is a song about living together in a world without hungry people and war. In the video for Imagine, John is sitting at a white piano in a white room. But the shutters on the windows are closed. Then Yoko opens the shutters. The summer sun comes into the room, and John sings. He sings of his dream, and it is a beautiful one. A dream of a better world for everyone.